the dust settled in a man's soul the same way it settled on a forgotten grave. For Kane, the two were indistinguishable. He drifted through the skeletal town of Promise, a place whose name was a bitter joke spat from the mouth of a dying prospector, with the weight of a past he couldn't outrun chained to his ankles. Each step was a memory of failure, a ghost child's face shimmering in the heat haze above the cracked earth. He was a vessel hollowed out by guilt, motivated only by the gnawing emptiness in his belly and the primal instinct to see one more sunrise. In the saloon, a den of stale whiskey and shattered dreams, he nursed a glass of warm water, his last 2 bits sweating on the warped wood of the bar. It was there he heard the laughter, thick and cruel like curdled milk. Bartholomew Thorne's men, fat on their master's coin, were celebrating a piece of business. They spoke of a patch of useless land, a cursed hollow known as Coyote's Tooth, sold off the books to wash Thorne's hands of it. It had a dilapidated ranch and a poisoned well, they crowed, a place where nothing grew but regret. As a final joke, they'd put the deed up for $10, the price of a cheap bottle. A thought, sharp and mad, pierced the fog of Kane's despair. It was a joke that suited his life perfectly. He pushed himself off the stool, his shadow long and gaunt in the lamplight, and walked toward their table. The $10, his entire worldly wealth, felt as heavy as a tombstone in his palm. He dropped it on the table. The coins didn't ring, they thudded like dirt on a coffin. The laughter died. He took the deed without a word and walked out, the silence of the saloon at his back. He didn't know he was walking toward a reckoning. He only knew he had bought himself a place to die. The journey to Coyote's Tooth was a pilgrimage through purgatory. The sun was a merciless hammer beating the life from a landscape of bone-white rock and thorny scrub. The wind whispered lies of cool water, a mournful song that scraped against Kane's frayed nerves. This was a land that held grudges, that remembered every drop of blood it had ever tasted. When he finally saw the ranch, it was less a structure and more a suggestion of one, its timbers warped and bleached like the ribs of some great beast that had crawled there to expire. It sagged against the base of a rock formation shaped like a predator's fang, a fitting name for a place so steeped in desolation. He expected the poisoned well the men had laughed about, the final, fitting irony. Instead, nestled in a shaded alcove behind the shack, he found a spring. The water wasn't poisoned, it was impossibly clear, bubbling from the earth with a quiet persistence that felt like a rebellion. It pooled in a stone basin, reflecting the hard blue sky with a purity that seemed alien in this world of grit and decay. This single point of life in a universe of dust was a paradox that his exhausted mind couldn't solve. It was a symbol of a hope he no longer believed in, a heart still beating in a corpse of a landscape. He knelt, his reflection a gaunt stranger staring back at him, and plunged his hands into the cool, living water. The shock of it was like a baptism and a jolt of lightning, a sensation so clean it felt like it was scouring the filth from his very soul. He drank deeply, the water a blessing on his cracked lips, and felt a stillness he hadn't known in years. It was a fragile peace, one he knew the world would soon come to shatter. He pushed open the shack's groaning door, the interior a tapestry of dust motes dancing in the slanted light. And she was there. Not a squatter, not a vagrant, but a figure of impossible stillness, sitting on a simple stool as if she had been waiting for a lifetime. She wore the worn but intricate silks of a world away, her black hair coiled in a severe knot, her face a mask of calm resolve. She was an orchid blooming on a battlefield. This was the place's second paradox. His hand went to the worn grip of his pistol, a reflex born of a life where the unexpected was always a threat. But she did not flinch. Her eyes, dark and deep as the spring water, met his without fear. They held a wisdom that felt ancient, a profound sorrow that echoed his own. There was no surprise in her gaze, only a quiet, weary recognition. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken questions. He was the intruder here, the ghost stumbling into a sacred space. He opened his mouth to speak, to demand, to question, but the words died in his throat. Before he could find his voice, she spoke. Her voice was low, and carried a strange, lilting accent, but the word was clear, a single, impossible syllable that struck him like a physical blow. It was a name he hadn't heard spoken with any kindness in years, a name he associated only with the specter of his failure. Came the sound of it in this desolate place, from the lips of this impossible woman, was not a question, but a statement. A summons. The mystery of the spring was suddenly dwarfed by the mystery of her. The world tilted on its axis, and Cain, the man who had bought a place to die, realized he had instead stumbled into a story that had begun long before he arrived. The first days passed like a fevered dream, a silent negotiation between two wounded animals forced to share a den. He learned her name was Mai. She spoke little English, and he spoke no Chinese, but they communicated in the universal language of survival. He watched her, his suspicion a coiled snake in his gut. He was a man of dust and gunpowder, she was a creature of water and ritual. Each morning, she would go to the spring, her movements a slow, deliberate prayer. She would clear away any fallen leaves, her hands treating the stones around it with a reverence he couldn't comprehend. He saw she was not merely living by the spring, she was its keeper. He began to work, his hands finding a strange solace in mending what was broken. He replaced rotten boards on the porch, patched the leaky roof, secured the door frame. The work was hard, honest, and it quieted the ghosts in his mind, if only for a few hours at a time. It was an act of building, and he had only known how to destroy for so long. He was fortifying the shack, creating a defense against the world, and in doing so, he was unknowingly fortifying himself. Mai would leave a bowl of simple broth or a piece of bread for him, sustenance offered without a word, an acknowledgement of his labor. One evening, as the sky bled purple and orange, he saw her tending a small, hidden garden behind the shack, coaxing green life from the unforgiving soil. She was a guardian of life in a kingdom of death, and he, a man who had failed to protect her life, was now living under her roof. The irony was a constant, dull ache in his chest, a reminder of the debt he could never repay. The world arrived on a tide of dust and arrogant laughter, just as Cain knew it would. 3 of Thorn's men rode into the hollow, their faces smug with the casual cruelty of those who serve a powerful master. They were surveyors, sent to map the land for Thorn's railroad, the $10 deed a forgotten piece of paperwork. They saw the mended porch, the wisp of smoke from the chimney, and their expression soured. Then they saw Mai by the spring. To them, she was a trifle, an exotic trespasser. Their words were foul, slithering things that defiled the quiet air. They dismounted, their spurs jingling a predatory rhythm, and advanced on her. Mai stood her ground, her small frame radiating a strength that belied her size. She was a rock against which their filth broke and receded. Cain had been watching from the shadows of the porch, cleaning his pistol, a task that had become its own ritual. He had told himself this wasn't his fight. He owned the deed, but he was just passing through, a ghost haunting his own life. He had no cause, no purpose. But as he watched their leering faces, as he saw the shadow of their malice fall upon her, something inside him snapped. A memory, sharp as a shard of glass, tore through him, another moment, another vulnerable figure, another time he had failed to act quickly enough. He wouldn't fail again. He stepped from the shadows, the click of the hammer on his pistol echoing like a gunshot in the sudden silence. He didn't shout, didn't threaten. His voice was low, a gravelly rumble that promised violence. That's far enough. The men turned, surprised. They saw not a broken drifter, but a man whose eyes held a cold, dead certainty. They saw the steady hand holding the gun. They were bullies, not fighters. They blustered, they threatened, but they saw the abyss in Cain's gaze and took a step back. They mounted their horses and rode away, promising a swift return with reinforcements. Cain didn't watch them go. He looked at Mai, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of something other than sorrow in her eyes. It might have been gratitude. It might have been understanding. He had drawn a line in the dust, and now, for better or worse, he was on her side of it. That night, the atmosphere in the small shack shifted. The wall of silence between them had been breached, not by words, but by action. Trust, a fragile seed, had been planted. After their sparse meal, Mai beckoned him to follow her outside to the spring, the moonlight silvering the landscape. She knelt by the ancient stones that formed the basin, stones he'd thought were just rocks. But in the pale light, he saw they were covered in faint, intricate carvings. They were characters, ancient and worn smooth by time. She traced them with her finger, her touch gentle, reverent. Then, she began to tell him the story. Her English was broken, a mosaic of single words and expressive gestures, but her meaning was clear. She drew pictures in the dust with a stick. She drew a mountain, then a line flowing down from it, the spring. She called it the breath of the mountain. Her family, for generations uncounted, had been its guardians. They had been sent from their homeland to protect it. Then she drew a man of fire and iron, Thorn, who wanted to capture the breath, to chain it to his machines and bleed it dry. Finally, she drew a figure with a mark on his brow, a wanderer, a broken soldier. She looked at him, her dark eyes intense, and pointed to the drawing, then to him. A prophecy. A vision her grandfather had seen in a dream long ago. A man would come, haunted and lost, bearing a name that meant both farmer and killer, a man who would become the spring's unlikely champion. The name he had heard in that vision, the name passed down to her, was Cain. The revelation settled over him, not with a crash, but with a profound, terrifying stillness. His whole life, a random, cruel series of events, suddenly felt like a path that had been leading him to this exact spot. His guilt, his failure, was not just a burden, it was the very thing that had qualified him for this. He wasn't just protecting a woman or a piece of land. He was standing against the dark to protect a flicker of light, and in doing so, perhaps, find a way to forgive himself. The retaliation was swift and brutal. Thorn did not send surveyors this time. He sent thugs, a dozen of them, led by a foreman with a face like a clenched fist and eyes devoid of light. They rode in not to intimidate, but to destroy. Their goal was simple: drive them out or bury them, and foul the spring so it was useless to anyone. The attack came at dawn, the rising sun backlighting their menacing silhouettes. Cain was ready. The years of drifting hadn't softened him, they had honed him into a keen, sharp edge of survival. The fight was not a noble duel, it was a desperate, ugly brawl for existence. Gunshots splintered the morning quiet. Cain moved with a fluid, deadly economy he had forgotten he possessed, using the rocks and the shack itself as cover. He was a wraith, firing, moving, reloading, his mind a cold, clear machine of tactical thought. This was the man he used to be, the man he had tried to bury under years of whiskey and regret. But Mai was not a damsel to be rescued. She was a warrior in her own right. She moved through the familiar terrain like a spirit of the land itself, creating diversions, sending rocks tumbling down from the ridge at critical moments. The wind itself seemed to be her ally, a sudden, violent gust whipping a cloud of blinding dust into the foreman's face just as he took aim at Cain. The fight was a blur of noise, pain, and adrenaline. Cain took a bullet, a fiery tear through his shoulder, but he fought on, fueled by a purpose that burned hotter than the pain. Together, they were more than Thorn's men had bargained for. They were not two desperate squatters, they were the land's own immune response, fighting off a poison. Bleeding and bruised, they drove the attackers away, leaving them to retreat in disarray. The hollow fell silent again, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder and the coppery tang of blood. They had won the battle, but Cain knew the war had just begun. Thorn would not be denied a second time. He would come himself. Mai tended to his wound with a practiced, gentle efficiency. Her small hands cleaned the gash, packed it with a poultice of herbs he didn't recognize, and bound it tightly. Her touch was professional, yet it carried an unspoken tenderness that went deeper than the bullet. In that quiet moment, as she worked and he endured the stinging pain, a profound understanding passed between them. They were bound together now, by blood and battle and a shared purpose. Their survival was intertwined with the survival of this small patch of earth and its sacred water. They spent the next 2 days in a state of quiet preparation, a calm before the inevitable hurricane. Cain, his arm in a sling, used his remaining strength to fortify their position. He barricaded the windows, leaving small slits to fire through. He set snares and simple traps in the narrow paths leading to the hollow, using the hunter's knowledge he'd gathered in his years of wandering. Mai, in turn, prepared in her own way. She gathered water from the spring, storing it in clay pots. She sharpened tools that could be used as weapons. She walked the perimeter of their small territory, her bare feet seeming to read the land, her eyes noting every rock, every bush, every shadow that could be used for cover or concealment. The land held its breath, the air growing heavy and charged. The cicadas fell silent. The wind died down to a whisper. It was a listening silence, as if the rocks and the ancient spring itself were waiting for the final onslaught. Cain looked at Mai, her face serene and determined in the fading light. He had come here to find a place to be alone, to let his world shrink to the size of a grave. Instead, he had found a reason to fight, a home to defend, and a partner whose strength mirrored the quiet, unyielding power of the land itself. The world-weary drifter was gone. In his place stood a guardian. Bartholomew Thorn arrived as the sun reached its zenith, casting harsh, unforgiving shadows across the hollow. He did not come as a raider, but as a king, flanked by 20 armed men, a small army against their fortress of 2. He was a man suffocated by his own wealth, his fine suit and obscenity in the rugged landscape, his face soft and pale with the indoor corruption of power. He rode forward under a white flag, halting a short distance from the shack. His voice, used to commanding and being obeyed, boomed across the clearing. He offered Cain a deal. A bag of gold, more money than Cain had ever seen, enough to disappear and start a new life anywhere. "Walk away from this pile of rocks," Thorn sneered, gesturing dismissively at the spring. "It's just water. I'm offering you a future." Cain stood in the doorway, his wounded shoulder a burning fire, his pistol a cold weight in his good hand. He looked past Thorn's fleshy face, past the cold, dead eyes of his hired guns, to the shimmering surface of the spring. He saw Mai standing near it, a silent sentinel. It wasn't just water. It was heritage, it was life, it was a promise. It was the last pure thing in a world that Thorn and men like him were trying to pave over and bleed dry. He had already had a future once, and he had failed it. This was his chance to protect a present. His answer was not a word, but an action. He raised his pistol and fired a single shot into the dirt at Thorn's feet. The siege began. The air exploded into a cacophony of gunfire. It was a desperate, impossible fight. Cain used tactics and precision, making every bullet count, while Mai used the land as her weapon, her traps sowing confusion and chaos among Thorn's men. The battle raged, a brutal symphony of splintering wood and ricocheting lead. Finally, Thorn, enraged and impatient, led a final, foolish charge himself. It was then that Cain, in a move of pure, cold desperation, did the one thing they didn't expect. He ignited the small store of lantern oil he'd positioned, creating a wall of fire that separated Thorn from his men. In the smoke and chaos, Cain confronted him. It was no longer about guns. It was about 2 opposing forces of nature. The man who wanted to own the world, and the man who was finally willing to die for one small piece of it. The dust settled slowly, reclaiming the hollow in a quiet, hazy shroud. Thorn was defeated, his greed finally meeting an immovable object. His remaining men scattered like rats, leaving their master to the justice of the land he had tried to conquer. The silence that followed the storm of violence was profound, broken only by the gentle, eternal bubbling of the spring. The water flowed on, clear and undisturbed, indifferent to the affairs of men. Cain stood over the still, pure pool, his body a map of new pains, his shoulder a searing agony. He looked at his reflection, but the stranger he saw was different now. The haunted, hollowed-out shell was gone. In its place was a man who had been tested by fire and had not been consumed. He saw the face of a protector. He had not erased his past, but he had finally balanced the scales. He had met his guilt head-on and found not oblivion, but purpose. Mai came to stand beside him. She said nothing, but her presence was a comfort, a statement of a shared future forged in conflict. They had defended their home. He was no longer a drifter, a piece of tumbleweed blown by the winds of fate. He had put down roots in the most unlikely of soil. The sun began to set, painting the stark rocks in hues of gold and rose, and for the first time in a decade, Cain felt the quiet, simple, and overwhelming sensation of peace. It was a fragile peace, a hard-won peace, but it was real. He had found his redemption not in a church or at the bottom of a bottle, but here, in a forgotten hollow, beside a silent spring and an outcast woman who had somehow known his name all along. So, what do you believe became of Cain and Mai in that quiet hollow? Did the peace they fought so fiercely for hold against the relentless march of the world, or was their battle just the first of many? We read every single one of your thoughts, so let us know what you think in the comments below. Their story is a testament to the fact that even in the most desolate of places, hope can spring eternal, and redemption can be found by those brave enough to fight for it. If you were moved by this tale of a broken man finding his purpose in the unforgiving West, please give this video a like and subscribe to our channel for more dramatic stories of struggle and triumph. You won't want to miss the next story we have unearthed from these dusty plains, a tale of a lone sheriff who discovers the town he protects is guarding a secret far older and more dangerous than any outlaw.